The Guyana-Venezuela controversy has captured the attention of Guyanese at home and abroad. But what does this all mean for Guyana? In an effort to clarify the issue, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has put together a series of initiatives, of which this is one. Welcome to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs panel discussion, the Guyana-Venezuela controversy. In the studio with me today, I have the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Honourable Carl Barrington Greenidge, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs under the Burnham administration, Mr. Rashleigh Jackson, OR, and Miss Donnette Streete, who is currently the Director of the Foreign Affairs Department, the Borders Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Welcome.
Thank you.
Little background to all of my guests. Both our foreign ministers were born in New Amsterdam, I must mention. And Mr. Greenidge, I'll start with you. You've been a former Minister of Finance, Planning and Trade. You've distinguished yourself in your service to your country, Guyana, and the Caribbean, the African and Pacific Group. You've worked on Guyana's economic recovery program, and you've also published, I think, 4 monographs, numerous academic articles on economics, and contributed to books on a variety of issues. You've also been co-president of the Joint Council of Ministers of the European Union and ACP states. Minister Carl Greenidge.
Thank you very much.
Ms. Streete, I understand that you are the Director of the Frontiers Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and you've been acting in that position since 2012. You have a wealth of experience on border matters, and you've participated in numerous regional and international meetings at the bilateral level for Guyana. In addition, you have done studies in law and a postgraduate in legislative drafting and international studies, and numerous follow-ups at the University of Malta and United Nations University, Ms. Donnette Streete. And of course, last but certainly not least, our former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Rashleigh Esmond Jackson. Welcome. Joined the civil service in 1949, received scholarship to study in the United Kingdom 1954, educated at University of London and University of Leicester, taught at Queen's College 1957 to 64, joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1964, becoming Permanent Secretary in 1968, and went on to be Foreign Minister starting 1978, ending 1990. You're the recipient of the Order of Roraima in 1991. Distinguished guests, I must welcome you and, of course, start the discussion as to what is the Guyana-Venezuela controversy. I'll start with you, Foreign Minister. Obviously, this goes back a long way. My first recollection of anything to do with a border issue in this country would have been long before I was born. 1899 is the first date that I recall, so maybe you can bring us up to date as to what that date represents in this whole line of events.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to participate in this exercise with you and to join colleagues and former colleagues. The date 1899 was the date on which the arbitration panel gave its decision on claims by Venezuela, Britain, as regards the boundaries between Guyana and British Guyana at that time and Venezuela. And the significance of that award is that it followed a series of actions. If you like, going furthest back, the first series of actions began with Venezuela's attempts to get the United States to intervene in the delineation of the border by pressing the United Kingdom, Great Britain that is, to agree to some arbitration over the borders. And the arbitration arose because in the 1840s, at least that's my understanding, you had the so-called gold shouts. There was the discovery of gold in the areas Cayuni, Mazaruni, and as a consequence, you had within the British Guyana's borders several people congregating from all over the place to mine gold. And from that time onwards, Venezuela began agitating, trying to get the Congress to get the UK government to press for redefined borders that would allow that area to fall within Venezuela's purview. And it was a long process. On the Venezuela side, there were companies involved in trying to start economic activities close to the border area. But at the end of it, in 1895, the United States and the United Kingdom came to a point after attempts by the US government now to force the British government to agree to some mediation, cum arbitration of the line, and in 1895 even a threat by the United States to instigate a war against the Great Britain over the borders. And in 1897, a treaty was signed between the two countries, which treaty made provision for an arbitration panel and for the findings of the arbitration panel to be regarded as final and binding. That's not the exact language, but words to that effect, at which time they also agreed on the composition of the arbitration panel. That is the significance of 1899. It is, in effect, a quasi-judicial decision which definitively set the borders. It has never been changed or overturned by any legal court, any court of any kind, any change in legislation or any understanding between the United Kingdom, the United States, and Venezuela, who were party to the Treaty of 1897, which set up the arbitration panel.
Okay, so this arbitration panel was set up with a view to reviewing that award, or was this a definitive and final statement?
The arbitration panel was established not to review the award, but to review the claims by the various parties to the territory that constituted the borders between the two countries. And they were, for example, British claims based upon their own work, commissioned by the British, including the work of Schomburg. And on the Venezuela side, you had a number of claims by Venezuela to parts of the Essequibo land lying to the east of the Essequibo River. Not all, but some parts thereof.
Okay. I want to bring in former Foreign Minister. Mr. Jackson, tell me a little bit about your period while as Foreign Minister. What were the issues that kind of came towards this whole discussion between the two countries?
Well, you've made a historical leap.
Yes, I know I have, but I think what I'm attempting to do is to get a general understanding of where the difficulties arose.
Well, before that, may I just say something to emphasize something the Minister said, that in the 1897 arbitration treaty, both sides agreed to accept the award of the arbitration as a full, final, and perfect settlement of the border. So that is a commitment made before the arbitrators met. Mm-hmm. That whatever the arbitrators decide on, both sides will accept as a full, final, and perfect settlement. I think it's important to remember that. Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of when I became Foreign Minister, that was the time when the Geneva Agreement was being implemented. That's why I said it made a historical leap. Because...
So, well, maybe what you can do for me then is introduce me to the Geneva Agreement, because I am not au fait with what were the terms of that agreement.
Well, before the Geneva Agreement, you had the resuscitation of the Venezuela. You see, the border was settled, and you had, as the Minister said, the resuscitation of the Venezuelan claim in 1962 at the United Nations. And then it was made perfectly clear to the Venezuelans that the revision of the frontier would not be entertained at all. In fact, the British representative at the United Nations actually used these words. I think these words are very instructive. He said, in making this offer, that's an offer to examine documents, I must make it very clear that it's in no sense an offer to engage in substantive talk about revision of the frontier. That we cannot do, for we consider that there is no justification for it. So I'm saying that in the process leading up to the Geneva Agreement, there was a clear statement on the part of Britain that the question of the revision of the frontier was not on. That what we would do is to deal with a Venezuelan contention that the arbitral award was null and void. And that is what led to the Geneva Agreement.
And this Geneva Agreement was done in 1962, you say?
66.
66. And this is the year of our independence.
That's right.
But was it done prior to our independence or subsequent to our independence?
It was done in February 1966. You see, there's a period after Venezuela raised the claim in 62. The British offered to examine documents to put their minds at rest. That examination took place with experts from Venezuela, Britain, and British Guyana. On the British and the British Guyana side, we said there was no evidence that supported the Venezuelan claim. No evidence. Then this was subsequently followed up by a ministerial meeting. And so in a certain sense, in hindsight, it can be regarded the process, the Geneva Agreement, the process that led the Geneva Agreement was really a face-saving thing for Venezuela. It was a political process to find a way of getting them to come off the tiger's back, of writing this ridiculous claim. Very ridiculous claim. And so the Geneva Agreement then made provision for a proper and civilized manner of dealing with the Venezuelan claim that the 1899 award was null and void. So that brings us to the Geneva Agreement.
That was where the Geneva Agreement came into place. So what did this Geneva Agreement really allow? Because it was not going to revisit the borders at all. So what did it really allow? Maybe I can ask Ms. Streete to answer that one.
Thank you. Yes. The Geneva Agreement was signed with, and it says specifically that the parties will search for a practical solution to the controversy that arose as the result of Venezuela's contention that the arbitral award, which definitively settled the boundary between British Guyana and Venezuela, was null and void. So that is the intent of the Geneva Agreement. It, as a matter of fact, the Geneva Agreement does not mention the Essequibo. It does not talk about revisiting borders or boundaries that were already settled. It says basically that Venezuela claims that the arbitral award is null and void, and this agreement is intended to give the parties the opportunity to examine that Venezuela claim. So that is what Guyana expected, I think, and that is what we still expect, that Venezuela would maybe provide some information to support its claim of nullity of the arbitral award. And from 1966 to 2016, Venezuela has not produced one shred of evidence to support its contention that the arbitral award of 1899 is null and void.
Okay, which brings me to the next question, really, because the issue seems to be here the sanctity of agreements.
Yes.
Are we saying then that Venezuela as a country is not party to the sanctity of agreements?
That is That is a very good question. That the principle of the sanctity of agreements is an internationally recognized principle. It says that, for example, the Vienna Convention on Law of Treaties talks about the principle of pacta sunt servanda, that when you enter into these agreements, you enter into the agreements on good faith. And though that convention came after the issue with Venezuela, it codified what was customary international law at the time. So we have an expectation, like, for example, former Minister Jackson spoke of the 1897 Treaty of Washington, and where, that Venezuela, and it says that the parties agree that the results of the arbitration process would be a full, perfect, and final settlement. Venezuela signed that agreement. Lo and behold, following the 1899 arbitration, more than 60 years after, Venezuela broke that particular agreement that she entered into with Venezuela.
So does this say anything? And I want to bring you in here, Minister. Does this say anything about how we treat with each other as countries in the world internationally, as an international thing? What is the problem here that this brings to the fore?
Well, the identification or remarking or resetting of borders prior to the 20th century, and certainly prior to the Second World War, was something that was effected by and large by dint of force or by various modes of intrigue. By and large, borders continue to be changed, and these borders that we're discussing between the United Kingdom and its colonies and Venezuela and its colonies, like those elsewhere, was settled by power. The world has arrived at a point at which it's decided borders should not be changed in that way because of the social disruption, the war, the carnage, and so forth. And therefore, by way of the League of Nations and the various treaties, as well as by...
to which both countries are party.
That's correct. There's an understanding, there's an agreement that whatever may have been the rights and wrongs of borders set by colonial powers, we are not going to be trying to change those borders by virtue of the exercise of power or guile or any other mechanism. Indeed, the danger of trying to do such a thing in these Americas should be evident from the fact that Brazil, our
other neighbor,
one of them, is party to 10 agreements, 10 treaties governing their borders. They have 10 neighbors. Now, you can imagine one of those neighbors waking up one morning and deciding to change the border that they have. What implications that will have for the others? Venezuela's borders with Guyana are also contiguous with borders with Brazil. And that area that Venezuela is seeking to dispute is also an area that was claimed by Brazil. So when you reopen the borders with Venezuela, it has implications for the standing of Brazil, with whom we have also got a border agreement, and an agreement that Venezuela itself was party to, because there's a tripartite junction, and a border was agreed between the three countries. So the international community has good reason for not encouraging changes in the borders at the whims and fancies of governments or governments seeking after past imperial glory. I can say to you that Venezuela inherited from Spain through the so-called Gran Colombia, a territory. Guyana inherited from Great Britain a territory. Guyana itself, as British Guyana, never at any point came under the dominion of Spain. It never came under the dominion of Venezuela either. So part of the discussion that Venezuela seeks to base their claim on is just ridiculous. You can't fight the Battle of the Spanish Succession, which took place in 1648 when the Dutch, the Low Territories, broke away. But that is what we seemingly having to contend with. A country signed an agreement, it demarcated those agreements with British and Guyanese technicians between 1899 and 1904. As Donnette pointed out, there are now legal conventions determining behavior or how you deal with an agreement. In fact, one of those also has to do with the fact that you should not be reopening or entertaining the reopening of an agreement 61 years after that agreement was signed and 10 or more years after there has been no challenge to the agreement. Venezuelan foreign ministers, Venezuelan presidents had continually over the years, post 1905, said that they respected the agreement. The agreement wasn't perfect, but it was in keeping. It was in keeping with what was proper, and what is more, at various points until close to 1962, acknowledged that they were the beneficiaries of the largest, if you like, they were beneficiaries of a significant economic scale in respect of those borders, because the mouth, the Orinoco estuary, from which Venezuela's oil flows and which harbors the largest reserves of petroleum in the world, were transferred from Guyana, from the British, to Venezuela under that arrangement. So it is not the case that you can argue that the agreement is null and void because it disadvantaged us, because the very agreement has enabled Venezuela to be the world's largest repository of petroleum resources. And you can't, by the same token, argue that the legislation or the legal decision disadvantaged you, when in fact it's obvious to everyone that it was a major advantage to Venezuela. But you can't wake up a morning when circumstances have changed and decided that the advantage is not as great as you would have liked, you want more, and you reopen the agreement. That is where the issue lies. The question of good faith is that no agreement of any kind, no legal judgment is ever perfect. But in this particular case, as in any court, one, you have the passage of time, and that disqualifies Venezuela. But the other is that there has to be a basis upon which you argue that a treaty or an arbitration award is null and void. They have never substantiated that allegation by the provision of any information. And for a president to stand up every other day, show you a map, and argue that that on the basis of historic rights they are entitled is not a sufficient basis. It's not an acceptable basis for deeming a decision null and void. There are standard practices in the international courts for determining nullity or otherwise, and none of those has been met by Venezuela.
Foreign Minister Jackson. Yes, I was just going to bring you in because I know that there is the perception, and this is, of course, put forward by Venezuela, that some gentleman, having died, left some paperwork stating that he had issues with the former agreement. Maybe you can bring that to light and let us understand exactly what all that is about.
You're talking about the Malaprovos memorandum. Before I do that, I'd like to get back to the thing about sanctity of treaties to support what the minister is saying. There are certain basic principles of as you raise. Mm-hmm. How do states behave to each other in relations between states? They're guided by certain principles of international law. Like, for instance, the non-use of force, the peaceful settlement of disputes. And another one is the sanctity of treaties. And that's a very cardinal norm of international law. They're recognized by all countries. In the case of Venezuela, not only is she displaying a reluctance to to accept the sanctity of treaties. But she's violated every treaty that deals with or relations with Guyana and the border. The 1897 award, arbitral thing, with treaty, which said that she must accept as a full, final, and perfect settlement. She's abandoned that. The 1899 award, she says, is null and void. She's abandoned that. The 1905 demarcation, she's abandoned that. I mean, so it's not only the sanctity of treaties, it's the actual treaties that Venezuela has violated. And now this Malov a memorandum. A man who writes a memorandum says it must be published until he's dead. And after he's received an honor from Venezuela.
National honor.
I mean, it makes you feel suspicious as to why he wants to do all that. Why doesn't he publish a memorandum and get the same time? And in fact, his memorandum has been ripped to pieces by eminent lawyers. So it can't stand the paper on which it's written on. There are no arguments about it. And if that is the main basis for claiming nullity, then it means that Venezuela is wasting the time of the international community and is putting pressure upon Guyana, forestalling our development, and really bullying, is operating as an international bully against a big country of over 20 million people, putting pressure upon a small country of less than 1 million. I mean, it's not the way in which countries should behave towards each other, particularly developing countries. They should be helping each other.
I want to bring in Ms. Streete again. In our discussions, you have pointed to the fact that Venezuela has largely been upping the ante all the time. Yes. It started off as one thing and it's been changing as we went along to suit their needs.
Yes.
Give us an idea of what this means in real terms.
It means that at the beginning, Venezuela claimed that the 1899 arbitral award is null and void. If we were to look at that contention on the face of it, we would come, let's say the parties had decided to come to sit down to discuss it. Venezuela would produce her evidence to support her claim that the 1899 arbitral award is null and void. There would be a legal process that would follow. And that process that would follow does not necessarily mean that the exequable which Venezuela is claiming would go to Venezuela. It would be something totally different. Maybe if we reopen the issue of the border, maybe we would have a new case, a new arbitration, and maybe it would decide something totally opposite to what Venezuela thinks would happen.
Just to step in for 1 second before you continue.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It is my understanding that the border, when it was previously delineated, was way beyond where it is now. So at the point that Britain and Venezuela came to that agreement, we got even less than we were really supposed to have had in the first place. Guyana, that is.
That, yes, and the
so in any reopening, we would have to go back to that former border
and
to start here.
We would have to go back to what was the British claim and what was the Venezuelan claim at the time.
All over from
and the Brazilian.
Yeah.
Venezuela has said that because the arbitral award is null and void, it means that the entire Essequibo region belongs to her. That is a totally separate issue from a claim of nullity of an agreement, of an international award. Mm-hmm. That is true. Further to that, Venezuela has added, and you have seen maybe last year, you would have seen in the news, Venezuela has added another dimension. Okay, there's the claim that the 1819 arbitral award is null and void. Venezuela has graduated that to a claim to the entire Essequibo region. Okay, the Essequibo belongs to Venezuela. Then Venezuela has said now that the waters pertinent to the Essequibo belong to Venezuela. And you would have noticed that in 2015 in May, by that illegal decree that President Maduro had decreed, the waters appertinent to the coasts of Berbice and Demerara were also claimed by Venezuela. Venezuela had stretched her boundary, or maritime boundary, that is, with Guyana across the entire coast of Guyana, and Venezuela would, when we look at the map and when the coordinates were actually plotted, Venezuela would have had a maritime boundary with Suriname, which is really ridiculous. It is unknown to international law that a country that is neither adjacent or opposite to another country could conceivably have a boundary, a maritime boundary with that country. So it's really a ridiculous graduation of the claim, and that is one of the things that we have been saying. When Guyana is not dealing with a reasonable partner, we are not dealing with a partner who is willing to, follow the principles of international law as they relate to relations with neighbors, as they relate to the delimitation of boundaries, whether maritime, with their neighbors. And so that is something that it is really baffling. And not just that, it is really putting Guyana in a position where we are operating on the principles of international law. But Venezuela is not doing that. So it is difficult for us to sit to the table and to come up with reasonable solutions to iron out our differences, because one party is totally rogue, for want of a better term. And the other, Guyana, would like to stick to the principles of international law in our relations with our neighbor.
For Mr. Wong, bring you back in again, because I think in our understanding, this is people looking on at this issue and trying to get a handle on what really is going on. We keep hearing all kinds of different things. There is the Secretary General coming to visit Guyana, the UN Secretary General. What role is he playing? What does he have to say in the matter? What is a good officer? How does this thing really work? I mean, what is the current position, and what is it that we are advocating?
Thank you. I would like to try and answer that in two segments. One of them follows from Donnette's observations just now. First of all, in speaking again to the issue of respect for international law and the rule of law, one has also to bear in mind that in addition to breaching the Geneva Convention, which I'll come back to in a minute, Venezuela operates in this way. The disputes between countries can be settled by way of the a forum of last resort, which is the International Court of Justice, the ICJ. Venezuela, for purposes of the borders, refuses to acknowledge the authority of ICJ in that regard. So the possibility of getting legal relief is reduced by that position taken by Venezuela, since in normal circumstances, both parties have to agree to go to the court. At the same time, the maritime zone, which Donnette made reference to, is governed by the Law of the Sea Convention. So the point that she's making about Venezuela laying claim in an absurd way to a maritime space where they don't have a coast. It's the coast that determines your maritime space, and where they are claiming maritime spaces belonging not only to Guyana's EZ, but Guyana's extracontinental shelf, belonging to Suriname, also belonging to Cayenne, as well as Trinidad, Barbados, and the countries running from St. Kitts all the way down to Grenada. So it is not, this controversy is not merely a controversy between Guyana and Venezuela. It is between Venezuela and, in a sense, the world. Certainly the Caribbean, but it's the world, because you are faced by a country that refuses to respect international laws. So if one were to try to resolve the maritime space issue by resorting to the Law of the Sea Convention, Venezuela is not there. It's not there. They don't want to be bound by those rules. They want to deal with Guyana alone, and which is what they pitch the so-called clause in the Geneva Convention on, saying that the convention says that the two parties must find a political solution. Theirs must be a political solution where the big country can jump on the small one without reference whatsoever to the international law and the requirements of international law. That's what they're seeking. That's what they're working on. The Geneva Convention, however, does not make provision for a country like Venezuela to arbitrarily impose upon another just by virtue of
size.
Yes, a settlement. In fact, the problem of the maritime space takes us to the absurd situation also where the UN Law of the Sea Convention has defined a boundary between Suriname and Guyana, and Venezuela's claim breaches
that altogether.
Breaches that. So, what I want to say is that in recognition of these dangers, the Geneva Convention made provision for the two parties to use the existing mechanisms of international law. So, as it started off, it spoke about a mixed commission. The two sides had to work on the submission of information and data and so forth. Venezuela failed to provide such information. The agreement says beyond that the Secretary General can be called upon to settle the matter between the two countries if they can't find some way ahead between the two of them. The Secretary General can choose a means. Article 33, I believe, and Article 4.2. It also identifies a set of tools that could be used, and those range from you have conciliation, mediation, arbitration, and the use, if you like, by the Secretary General of his good office. I think there's a lot of I'll come to that here. There are a lot of misunderstanding about those tools. The one that people, I think, are clear about is the judicial settlement, resort to the International Court of Justice. But let me say that we have been arguing for the use of that tool because we believe that all the others have been tried and they have failed. So you've had arbitration, which is the source of the Venezuelan claim. If a country can be so untrustworthy as to sign an arbitration award, accept the gifts that have flowed from that award, and then to seek to overturn it afterwards, there's no sense in going back to arbitration. The others have been tried. Now, the Secretaries General in the past have used personal representatives, which flow from, if you like, the good offices of the Secretary General himself. And I mention this because there's some confusion. Venezuela is calling for good offices, and we seem to be going by the Secretary General and the International Court. It's simple. It's relatively simple. The Secretary General has the power to choose a means to resolve the matter if the two sides can't agree. What he has been doing, or what Secretaries General have been doing since 1982, is to identify persons as representatives of the Secretary General to speak with the two sides, to facilitate dialogue, to facilitate cooperation, and mechanisms that can eventually eliminate the controversy. In fact, all of those have failed. All have failed. Nothing has come out of it. As a matter of fact, at the end of that process, we have a situation in which Venezuela is occupying parts of Guyana, in which Venezuelan troops have crossed the borders, Venezuelan politicians have crossed the borders, Venezuela's aircraft have overflown Guyana, they've fired military and destructive weapons on Guyanese, including causing death, and they have seized vessels operating in Guyana's EEZ. The seizure of Anadarko's vessel.
And I just want to clarify that EZ means economic zone.
Yes, exclusive economic zone.
Exclusive.
This is that area that arises from Guyana having a coast, and the zone extends between borders of the two countries' midpoints, 200 miles north, and the world accepts an economic zone for Guyana as it accepts one for Suriname and Venezuela. But Venezuela's claims now are so arbitrary, let me put it that way, that they go beyond any reasonable boundaries, any recognized boundaries, any coast that Venezuela enjoys. So it'll be the only country in the world with an exclusive economic zone and maritime space where it doesn't have
a coast.
That is the long and the short.
One question I want to ask, because I'm thinking that, and this is of course in my non-understanding of this issue, it was Britain who had this
party to the arbitral award. Yes.
With Venezuela. So why aren't they going to Britain to deal with this?
Well, we are now an independent country. Venezuela found it convenient in 1966. The question you were having with Rashleigh was Venezuela saw that Guyana was going to become independent. And in order to put pressure on Guyana and Britain, it insisted that some agreement be settled between the two parties or it would take its own action. The British interpreted that, I believe, to be a threat to the emergent state, and therefore tried to find a way to save Venezuela from its own action, which could not possibly win in a court. That is the reason. So we are now, in a sense, on our own. However, Venezuela's claim as to what the Geneva Agreement means and what the British intended to the Geneva Agreement is something that the British can answer. And we have at various points in the past sought to make reference to the United Kingdom as regards this claim by Venezuela. And I believe in the recent past, the British here in Georgetown, the British High Commissioner has pronounced on it, and the British have elsewhere pronounced on the complete falsehood of the Venezuelan claim as to the meaning and as to the intention. And Rashleigh also read a minute ago what the British representative who was party to the Geneva Agreement, what he said the British understood and what all sides understood in that agreement. But just permit me one point to finish I was making about the good offices process. To say to you that these things having all failed, but Venezuela is insisting that you have another round of representatives of the Secretary General under the auspices of good offices. Guyana is saying this is pointless, it will result in a further erosion of Guyana's rights, has called upon the SG to use his powers to choose something, and to choose something other than another eminent person. In that regard, then, the option available to the Secretary General, as far as we're concerned, there's no point in repeating what you've been repeating with the same result for the past 50 years. You must try something new. It is in that regard that Guyana is pressing the UN Secretary General to resolve this matter finally, because the only final resolution is a resolution that turns on international law. Was anything that occurred in 1899 or after 1899 a reasonable enough grounds for the parties to say that the agreement is null and void? Is this agreement null and void in any sense? And Venezuela clearly is unwilling to go in that direction. Although in the notes of the Geneva Agreement, we find the Venezuelan representative admitting or acknowledging that in fact the Geneva Agreement does leave the option of going to the court. It is a legitimate option. It is the only one that is unexplored at this point in time, and it is one that we believe the Secretary General has no option but to choose if he intends to resolve this matter, which, if left unresolved, poses a threat to the peace and stability of the region, because, as we've shown, it touches on the rights of many other states in the region. Indeed, I would go on to say, and it is instructive, the only country, the only neighbor which Venezuela's action does not threaten, the only country that it does not seek to reopen its border with, is Brazil. And of course, Brazil is a regional giant. It's a global giant. And monkey know will limb to jump on. That is the case we're faced with.
So, former Foreign Minister Jackson, I'm going to bring you in once again. And I really want to go right back to where I started with you. Tell me, in your period as Foreign Minister, how did you see this process playing out, and what were the end results of the process at that time?
Well, I want to put that in the context that our relations with Venezuela have always oscillated between confrontation and cooperation, and it's always at Venezuela's bidding, because Guyana has always
sought for cooperation.
Yes, and has always sought to be a good neighbor, so that we have always, and even after my time, I think that has been the principal peg on which Guyana has hung its hat in its relations with Venezuela. I think under Chavez, it was felt that relations improved somewhat, and they worsened under Maduro. I'm saying it's always at Venezuela's bidding. During my time, it was when the good officers was in operation. In fact, when good officers was chosen, and it lasted for a long time. First under McIntyre, then I think under Jackman.
Yes.
By the time I left, so that under my time, it was only good officers. But you always sought to have good relations with Venezuela.
And I think in all efforts, we are always trying to ensure that we have good relationships with our neighbors.
Yeah.
But if we have a neighbor who insists on not living up to our international agreements, then we must, in a sense, put our foot down and say, well, it is just so far that we can go. And I want to bring you in here, Ms. Streete, again. As Director of Foreign Affairs, of course, your role is to constantly overview this issue and to look for the route to a solution. So where do we stand currently?
The 1899 arbitral award was the result of a legal process. Guyana recognizes this, and our position is that any question as to the validity or invalidity of this 1899 arbitral award is necessarily a legal question. And it is in this regard that the government of Guyana is saying that a legal solution is the best option of settling the controversy with Venezuela. And we have told the Secretary General so since 2012. And we continue to hope that the Secretary General, because the Geneva Agreement says that the Secretary General shall choose a means of settlement. And so Guyana has said to him that we prefer the judicial option, the judicial settlement. It would be a binding, a definitive settlement of the controversy, and Guyana is leaning towards that. And there's a process in train. The Secretary General is in communication with both parties currently on selecting a means of settlement, and we have consistently said that we prefer the judicial option. Venezuela, as you know, prefers to go back to the good offices process that was in existence for over 25 years that has borne no fruit, certainly not for Guyana. And so our position remains for now. That, the
Foreign Minister, I'll give you the last word as we wrap up. Obviously, your job entails relations with all the countries of the world. Venezuela is just one of them. This issue must have relevance for relations with all the other countries. You are in the position, of course, to be Guyana's representative on this issue. Give us your final thoughts on the matter.
Well, the point you make about the importance of the relations with Venezuela is very critical, and it determines actually how we approach all of our international partners and even the international bodies that we are members of. It means that we have, as a small state, dependent upon a clear understanding of the rest of the world of our rights. It means that we have to ensure that the world appreciates that in our own dealings with the rest of the world, we adhere scrupulously to the tenets of international law. That is a requirement that goes with this one. We also have to be sensitive to the needs of small states. Hence the President's presentation at the UN on the importance of the UN doing its business in such a manner as to not sit mum whilst advantage is taken of smaller and less powerful states. And it means that it is especially important that in our bilateral dealings we be good neighbors, not merely with Venezuela, but be good neighbors to all of the other countries in the international arena, and that they know that Guyana stands for something. It stands for principle, and it stands for the rights of individual states, whatever may be the temporary advantages or disadvantages from taking such a position. So in our dealings with USA, China, Canada, Suriname, and all the others, this is the principle that we stand firm on, and we believe that in the end, if this matter gets out of hand in a manner that Venezuela has tried to, as it did last year, for example, push the frontiers of its military, then the international community must be called on, and they will eventually respond to what is a threat to regional peace and security. The interest of the international community resides in an acceptance and the assertion of international law and the respect for the rights of all states, however small they may be, whatever their colonial origin. We cannot be in the ridiculous situation of a country arguing for the restoration of some portion of colonial borders, which borders were never its own in the first instance. So that is the situation. We believe it will be resolved. I don't think that you necessarily see a quick resolution. What has to be done reasonably quickly is the action of the UN Secretary General. We are sure that that will be done. It should be done within this year. After that, exactly how the matter is finally resolved will depend upon what is put in place. But the ICJ, there is none of the other options that is on the slate can give us the sort of resolution that the ICJ can give us, unless, of course, the Venezuelans withdraw the assertion. But we therefore expect that the Secretary General will do his duty, and that the ICJ will also do their duty. They are not there to apportion land to the states, but to give a ruling on the status of 1899 treaty. And once that is given, we believe it can only confirm that this is the relevant law, and Venezuela will have to live with that.
Thank you, sir. We've been sitting here this afternoon talking about the Guyana-Venezuela controversy. This has been one in a series of panel discussions from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I had as my guests Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Honourable Carl Greenidge, Miss Donnette Streete, who is the Director of
Frontiers.
in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Rashleigh Jackson. Thank you very much for your elucidation of this issue.
Thank you.